Hi, everyone, and welcome to On the Safe Side, a monthly podcast hosted by the editors of Safety and Health magazine, the official magazine of the National Safety Council. This is Barry Botino, associate editor at Safety and Health. With me, as always, are my fellow associate editors, Alan Ferguson and Kevin Drewley. Hey there, guys.
Hey, Barry.
Hey there. Happy July.
Well, thank you, Alan. And thank you, all of you, for joining us on the July 2024 episode of our podcast, which is number 53 in our history. This episode is sponsored by Gateway Safety, and we'll tell you all about them in just a few minutes. Does your organization have a CEO who just gets it when it comes to safety? If so, we'd like to hear all about it. Nominate your leader for the 2025 CEOs Who Get It, an annual awards recognition program from the National Safety Council for leaders who demonstrate a personal commitment to worker safety and health. Whether your organization has 50 or 50,000 employees, you can submit a nomination by August 25th at safetyandhealthmagazine.com/CEOs. That's safetyandhealthmagazine.com/CEOs. In this month's podcast, Kevin will discuss stories from the pages of our July edition of Safety and Health in this issue segment. We'll also be joined by our NSC colleague Rich Fairfax for our 5 Questions With interview. We'll get Rich's take on planned updates to OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. And of course, we'll get you all caught up on news from around the safety world in our In Case You Missed It segment. Is everybody ready? Away we go!
The July issue of Safety and Health offers an array of features, including one apiece from each of your humble On the Safe Side co-hosts. Alan takes a closer look at 7 things employers and workers should know about staying safe amid hazardous heat. Summer's upon us, and for many people that means the reality of working in high temperatures. Do you know the difference between heat-related illness versus injury, or on which grounds OSHA can cite employers for heat-related violations under the General Duty Clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970? If not, this feature has you covered. Next up is a feature story about safety data sheets. Near the start, one expert tells Barry that these documents are, quote, essential for a compliant hazard communication program, unquote. Indeed, the OSHA Standard on Hazard Communication, 1910.1200, requires safety data sheets to be presented in a 16-section format. While the story includes a look at each one and what's required within them, it also extends well beyond that, offering insight into interpretation, access, and other issues. Our July issue also includes a feature about the notion of positive reinforcement and how using it with safety professionals can help to transform organizational safety culture. I spoke with 4 occupational safety and health experts about why positive reinforcement is important, which elements are key to the approach, and how and when they've seen workers respond to positive reinforcement. One leader of the movement is Tim Neubauer, who's president and owner of Exceed Safety, LLC. As always, you can check out columns and insights from safety professionals and the latest news from around the occupational safety sphere in the magazine, too. Find our coverage in your mailbox each month or online at safetyandhealthmagazine.com.
For more than 80 years, Gateway Safety has been designing and manufacturing award-winning safety products. By providing personal protective equipment that's both comfortable and stylish, Gateway Safety is focused on helping employers increase safety compliance and improve the overall welfare of their employees. High-quality, third-party tested products from Gateway Safety are available in eye, face, head, hearing, and disposable respiratory protection. Want to learn more? Check them out online at gatewaysafety.com.
In May, OSHA published the update to its Hazard Communication Standard, and that final rule is slated to go into effect this month. Joining us to talk about the new HazCom rule is NSC Principal Consultant and former OSHA Deputy Assistant Secretary, Richard Fairfax. Rich, thank you so much for joining us here on the Safe Side.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
As I mentioned, the updated HazCom Standard is set to go into effect July 19th, but correct me if I'm wrong, OSHA is giving quite a bit of time for employers and manufacturers to get into compliance with the new standard.
That's correct. And just as an FYI for everyone, OSHA does this process of allowing people extra time from the effective date of a standard to get it implemented in their facilities. In this case, they're given a lot of time. For example, for updating safety data sheets and labels for chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors, they have to update the labels and data sheets by January 19th, 2026. So that's well over a year. If you're an employer and you're using chemicals and you're having to generate data sheets or produce labels, you have till July 20th of 2026. So again, well over a year, a little bit longer than an import or manufacturer. If your product is a chemical mixture and you're a chemical manufacturer or importer, you have until July 19th of 2027. So you have even further. Likewise, if you're an employer that's generating a mixture and having to produce data sheets or labels, you have until January 19th of 2028. Quite a grace period, if you will, for manufacturers and distributors or employers to update their data sheets and labels.
Well, Rich, OSHA states that the new standard will provide, quote, a clearer hazard classification process, unquote. What does that mean? Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's actually, yes, I can. That's actually quite complicated. Mostly what OSHA is referring to that is for addressing global companies that had facilities and establishments throughout Europe and in the United States, down in Mexico or whatever. Those countries have moved far ahead of OSHA as far as updating their hazard communication standard with the global harmonization, and OSHA is lagged quite a ways behind. So the main thing on this update, as I've gone through it, is aligning it more with the European Union updates for the global harmonization, which is a good thing because if you're a manufacturer and you have facilities in the United States and you have facilities in Europe, you're dealing with two separate standards, basically. So this aligns it. So that helps a lot. Under the revised OSHA hazard communication standard, it's very similar to the last one in that it requires employers, manufacturers, distributors, all those folks to evaluate their chemicals, to produce safety data sheets, to address labeling on the sheets. And we'll probably talk more about that in a little bit. But again, it aligns it with the European Union and it spells out what needs to be on those data sheets. As an example, OSHA updated the specifications for a number of physical hazards on the data sheet. Labels will have to provide the information, whether it's through pictograms or hazard statements or information on how employees can protect themselves through personal protective equipment. That is all spelled out. OSHA's always alluded to a 16-section format for data sheets, but that actually wasn't a requirement. With this update, they made several changes that align it with the European Union, but also specify that the data sheets now have to have 16 sections, and they basically have to follow a similar order. So anyone picking up a data sheet and they want to learn what sort of protective equipment they need, they know to go to the same section rather than having to thumb through, different data sheets to look at different requirements.
Well, Rich, you alluded to some of those changes with labels. What else might you like to spell out there?
Labeling's actually, as I went through it, is quite complicated, but let me say this impacts more the chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor of chemicals, less so on the actual employer. In fact, I don't think there's a lot of activity that an employer, which most people impacted by hazard communication are going to be, have to address other than assuring that the containers are labeled, assuring that the labels have the necessary information on it, and then assuring that their employees are trained on it. One of the most confusing things they did, and I had to read through this several times before I got it right, is they added under paragraph F, which is the labeling paragraph under hazard communication, they added a subparagraph and it's D1 double I, what it basically says, I won't go into how I was reading it or how other people, because I got actually a lot of questions on this, but you don't have to do anything with your labels or the data sheets unless, as an employer or a manufacturer or whatever, you decide to reclassify a chemical. And if you reclassify a chemical, then you've got to go in and adjust all that. If you're just accepting the data sheet and the label as it comes in and using it, you don't have to do anything. But a lot of people were reading that, and frankly, I was too when I read it the first time. It was like, oh, geez, I'm going to have to go through every single data sheet, every single label, make sure it is legit, and if it's not, either contact the manufacturer to get it legit or make those corrections myself, which was huge. The previous HazCom standard with OSHA, if it came with a DOT pictogram and your hazard pictogram was different, you had to use both on the label, which is quite confusing. This one basically says you can use whatever. Gives you, if you have to generate a label, you can either use the DOT one or the pictogram that's outlined in the Hazard Communication Standard. So it allows some flexibility, which, finally is a good thing. The other requirement, and this was always a confusing one, is if I'm a manufacturer and I produce a chemical and I put it in a container and I slap a label on it, or I put the identifiers on it, and then it goes to the company that bought the chemical, and they don't do anything with the chemical. They use it right out of the shipping container. OSHA was requiring them to put another label on it and all of that, which is a little bit redundant. And this update recognizes that problem from before and basically says if a shipping container is the use container at the site, you don't have to do anything with it if it's got the right label on it. So that was nice. Confusing piece was, well, there's a number of confusing pieces, but the confusing piece dealt with labeling of really small containers. And it's hard to keep a label on a small container. Then the information on the label has to be so tiny to get it all on the label that a lot of people couldn't read it or anything. OSHA, as sort of an interpretive piece, allowed placards and that sort of thing, but the problem was people would carry the labels off. So the update allows for fold-out labels that can be used. So, you can kind of pull it like on a small aspirin bottle. You can pull the label out and get all the information. They still allow the placards and stuff, but they basically allow you, if you can't get the information on a label that's in a readable fashion, they allow you to come up with alternative means. And that, like I said, it could be a placard or something like that. OSHA does clarify on labels that it has to have a pictogram, whether it's a GHS pictogram from the standard or it's a Department of Transportation guidance document that they put out for labeling the containers. But they do have to have a clear pictogram on it. In the last standard, it was there, but a lot of people were confused about it. And the purpose of a pictogram is there are so many languages that are used in different facilities that it wasn't reasonable to put multiple languages on a label, but a pictogram could be used provided the workers were trained in it. But that's kind of it on the labeling. I mean, in first brush through, it's kind of confusing, but it's mostly a simplification. And if something already has a label and it's a valid label and you're using that container in the workplace, you don't have to put your own label on it or whatever. So that's kind of a good thing.
For safety data sheets, OSHA is seeking to ensure trade secrets no longer prevent workers and first responders from obtaining hazard information. In what ways were trade secrets preventing this from happening, and what is now changing?
Employers have a right to protect their products that they sell. It's like a copyright almost. The original standard allowed employers to not only label a chemical that's used in a material as a trade secret, but also allowed employers to label the concentration of the chemical as a trade secret. So someone going through the standard, being trained on it, might see that there's these materials, they have different, permissible exposure limits, there's different requirements for personal protective equipment. But when they want to look up, see what the chemical is and read further about it or whatever, that was all listed as trade secret. Now, OSHA didn't really change that, but one of the things interpretively OSHA did in the past was say, well, you don't have to put the exact concentration, but you have to put a percent range of what the percent was. And what employers were doing, they would say, okay, chemical used here is trade secret, so we'll just put trade secret. As far as the percent, we'll put percent ranges 1 to 99%, something like that, which is kind of useless. OSHA had hoped originally when they did the standard, if you're using something with sulfuric acid, I'd want to know if it's 1% sulfuric acid or 90% sulfuric acid. Makes a difference. But when employers used a wide range, it sort of defeated that and didn't provide a mechanism for employees to realize that, boy, there's a lot of this stuff in this material. I need to absolutely make sure I'm wearing my gloves and face shields or whatever. So what OSHA did is they basically followed Canada's system for trade secret, and it allows if an employer or a manufacturer is claiming trade secret, they have to use prescribed ranges. So they can get away without labeling what the chemical is, that's a trade secret, but the standard spells out prescribed ranges. For instance, if there's 52% of this particular chemical in the solution, they can say it's from 30 to 60% or something like that. But it spells out a range how potentially concentrated that material is in the mixture without actually knowing the exact concentration. So it's basically better for protecting themselves and employers assuring that the workers are protected.
Well, Rich, as we wrap up, are there any other major changes that our listeners should know about that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, there's a lot. Sorry, there's a lot. Mostly center around chemical hazards and physical hazards. And basically for the physical hazards, they did some further explanation and redefining what, for instance, and I'll go through each of these, flammable gases, an aerosol, an oxidizing solid, and then they have a new category for desensitized explosives. And that's all new, spelled out, I think, in one of the appendices. So basically with flammable gases, they aligned it with change 7 of the global harmonization standard. You don't really need to know what change 7 is unless you want to, but it basically adds pyrophoric gases and unstable gases to the definition of what a flammable gas is. So it's not a big deal. It just adds 2 categories that are now included under hazard communication standard. Let's see, on aerosols. In the old standard, it was called flammable aerosols, and now they just call it aerosols. Then OSHA updated the standard and added aerosols into a line, again, with revision 7 of the European Union's global harmonization. They spelled out what non-flammable aerosols are in the standards, and they also added chemicals under pressure into the aerosol definition. So a chemical under pressure, if you open it, it's going to generate an aerosol because it's under pressure. So they basically included those elements. Oxidizing solids, I don't think there's a lot of people get into it, but there's enough that OSHA wanted to identify it. And so they took oxidizing solids that basically once it comes in with contact with air, it starts oxidizing and then can become very flammable or explosive. But what they did on that is they basically added a section on testing. And I'm not going to go into the testing because it is really, really long. There was an old test that basically set it at 0.1. The new test sets a new definition at 0.3. So they allowed a little bit more leeway. But I will tell you, that's all spelled out in an appendices of how the test is done, who has to do the test as far as certified bodies and things like that. Then the last category is what's called desensitized explosives. So if you have an explosive material, for instance, if it comes in contact with air or it is, violently shaken or something like that, it can explode. in many times they add a chemical to it or they inert it somehow so it is not an explosive. And they call it, I don't know why they call it this, but they call it a desensitized explosive. And if you have a desensitized explosive, you do not have to list it on the data sheet as explosive. On chemicals, there were 3 things that were done. I don't think any of them are really, really major. Is the first thing they did is they went through all the chemical definitions in the old standard and they updated them to align them with the global harmonization standard. So that was a good thing. And I actually read through it and I saw a few minor changes. As far as the whole issue of something being corrosive to the skin or corrosive to the eyes, basically what it allowed for is the original standard was based primarily on animal testing with some human testing data brought in. With the whole issue of, being humane to animals and stuff, the new standard as far as corrosiveness, irritation, sensitivity, sensitization, and all that can now be based on non-animal testing. So things like the Ames test or other testing operation are acceptable under the standard. As far as toxicity, human toxicity of chemicals, again, it was based solely on animal data. If there is human data available, for instance, benzene, there's a lot of human data available, from benzene from a lot of companies that exclusively use benzene. It allows the human data from, facilities and sites to come into play. Also, if there's human testing data, it allows for that. That's all. I mean, I've looked through it, and I will say there's a lot of people kind of panicking about it, but it's really more of an alignment with what's the European Union has gone, several years ahead of the United States. So it brings those standards together. So like I said, if you're a global company and you got sites in the United States and sites in the European Union, you're going to be now looking pretty much at the same standard. Stuff I liked about it is it does seem to clarify stuff that was confusing before, like on labels and transportation of materials and use of pictograms. So that's what I got.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with our audience, Rich. We appreciate you joining us here on the Safe Side.
My pleasure.
It likely isn't lost on you that we're in the middle of summer. If the warmer weather and the horde of remade game shows in primetime aren't convincing enough, we've told you once or twice in this, our July episode. Summer also means day trips and vacations and the like, so it's understandable that your focus may sometimes be elsewhere. That's why we're here with In Case You Missed It, a segment that aims to shine a light on news that might have slipped through the cracks. To get things started, in case you missed it, there's been quite a bit of information both from OSHA and the National Safety Council and elsewhere about MSDs, musculoskeletal disorders, which are the most common workplace injury and the second leading cause in shortening people's working years in the United States. With OSHA, they recently released guidance that informs employers and workers which musculoskeletal treatments are considered recordable. And on the NSC front, there was recently a white paper released that delves a lot deeper into the intersection of MSDs with diversity, equity, inclusion, or DE&I. And NSD's MSD Solutions Lab also recently passed a nice milestone. In the 2 years since the council launched the MSD Pledge in June 2022, and then later the Pledge 2.0 in October of last year, there have been more than 200 organizations representing nearly 3 million employees that have joined the effort to reduce the MSD risk and just enhance the physical and the psychological well-being of all workers. Another quick thing with MSDs in a separate story that's in the works, had spoken with NSC senior consultant Richard Flint, our buddy from episode 51, and he was talking just a little about common worksite hazards that he sees, and he says certainly one of them is MSDs. He says that, quote, "My eyes look for anything that would cause an MSD just because they're so underrated and so popular," unquote. One of the things that Richard said continually he is seeing that surprises him is there's still a lot of manual palletizing going on, and certainly a lot of that can be automated and put into machines. And he says certainly, though, that organizations might not always have that be in their budget to spend $100,000 to $200,000 on a new palletizer, but there certainly are things that they can do in the interim, including putting workers on an anti-fatigue mat so they're not standing on a hard floor all day, and also talked about the advent of the pallet balancer table that works that as you add weight to the table, it goes down, and then as you take weight off the pallet, it goes up. So again, lots of things out there with MSDs and more to come. Barry, how about you?
Well, Kevin, I recently wrote a news story for safetyandhealthmagazine.com, and it's about a survey by AARP and S&P Global, which is a financial analytics firm. And the story was about family caregivers. And I know a lot of folks out there who are working. A lot of my former and current coworkers also have family caregiving duties. And what the survey showed was that 67% of family caregivers are struggling to balance those caregiving duties with their work. And AARP went as far as to call on employers to create more friendly and more supportive policies. What the study did show is that is something that may be of interest to all of our listeners. Of those caregivers surveyed, 27% said they have gone from full-time work to part-time work, or they've reduced their hours because of family caregiving duties. And even 16% have turned down promotions because the family caregiving duties. AARP is asking of employers, as far as policies go, a couple examples they gave were offer more flexible schedules and work locations, such as hybrid or remote. Arrange for access for your employees for support groups or career coaching or financial advising, and even offered paid or flexible leave specifically for a worker's caregiving duties. So a really interesting story there, and I know that's something that does impact a lot of families. Alan, how about you?
You're a step closer to having a proposed rule for OSHA's heat standard. So that proposed rule went to the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on June 11th. And there is a chance that that review could be done by the time this podcast comes out, but it's doubtful the proposed rule itself will be out. But often these reviews do take a couple of months, 3 months. It's kind of unknown how long this will take. But yeah, we've gotten word that this proposed rule for OSHA's heat standard is closer to coming to fruition.
Well, now that you've heard from us, it's the turn of you, the listener. Is there something important that you've learned recently and want others in the safety world to know? Please email your thoughts and feedback to us at safehealth@nsc.org. We're eager to hear from you.
Thank you so much for listening to this month's episode. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending some of it with us. We encourage you to visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/podcast to check out any of our past episodes. One of those is episode 47 from January of this year, when we talked to Rich Fairfax about OSHA record-keeping changes. We'd also appreciate you rating, reviewing, or spreading the word about this podcast. You also can go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com for stories, news, and insights from around the safety world. And you can stay up to date by following us on your favorite social media channel. The original music for this podcast was composed by Steve Maslin. Thank you so much, Steve. And a big thank you to all of our NSC colleagues behind the scenes who make this podcast go. We'll be back next month to have more safety-related discussions, talk to trusted voices from around the profession, and hopefully make you smile a little. In the meantime, please stay on the safe side.